Cornell, Karen, Aundrea, thank you very much. I would love to give each of you an opportunity to just tell the crowd about yourselves. It's an honor to really have you here. And over the past year, I've spoken with you about the need to have this dialogue. And I'm so grateful to each of you for giving us your time. And I know that your thoughts are going to be even more valuable to the audience. So if we can start, I guess, left to right. Aundrea, could you tell us a bit about yourself and, if you'd like, a bit about Twilio? Aundrea, are you there?
She is here. That something for some reason she's not unmuting. So start with Cornell, and I'm gonna keep working on it.
Yeah, hello everyone. My name is Cornell Verdi Woodson, and I am the global head of diversity at Looker, which was just recently purchased by Google. So that's why Google there. So we're in the midst of a major transaction there and making all that come together in a clean and easy way, which is always fun. But my job at Looker is to build and execute on our global diversity strategy and making sure that the company understands how diversity, equity, and inclusion impacts all areas of the business from not only a US perspective, but from a global one as well. And I'm used to be based in Santa Cruz and based in San Leandro, California.
Excellent, excellent. Karen, can you tell us a bit about yourself, please?
Yeah, sure. My name's Karen Stevenson. I am what they would consider a professor at large because I've taught at a lot of universities, Harvard, Yale, Erasmus University in the UK, Singapore. My background is in the sciences. My PhD is from Harvard in anthropology, and so my contribution to the field has really been looking at diversity and inclusion using network science back when it was in its infancy decades ago, and now it's much more sophisticated. And what I do is I help governments and private organizations be able to see more clearly about diversity and inclusion and things that they can do to actually correct course and get there more rapidly. That's about it.
You have some great insights for us, but let me allow Aundrea. Could you please introduce yourself? Tell us a bit more about you and Twilio.
Hello everyone. Thanks for having me today. My name's Aundrea Long. I work at Twilio, where I do manage our global diversity events. And with that, I'm going to all of the cities where we have offices and talking about topics of inclusion and talking about what does diversity and inclusion look like specific to this region and specific to this culture. So I'm really excited to dive a little bit deeper into this topic today.
Excellent, excellent. My name is Waziri Garber. I'm the founder of Harlem Labs. I'm an avid entrepreneur, father of three, and big fan of technology. But more importantly, I'm a lover of community and really getting to know great people and building value with those communities. And so over the course of many years, I've worked at different companies and met my challenges. And over time, I've also encountered people who impressed upon me this resilience and this willingness to learn and overcome. And that was what really brought this conversation about, in witnessing people speak about the challenges they faced and playing unconscious bias in their favor. How did we actually understand there was a problem and then adjust in a way that allowed us to overcome that? And so I'd love to just open with a question for the panel, and I would love for you guys to just speak freely. Could you give some examples of experiences that you've had with unconscious bias and the steps that you took to overcome it? And, with your different backgrounds, I'm pretty sure you can give us a diverse, series of challenges that we all might face, but finding out how you thought through it and your intentionality in addressing it is really critical for us.
Who starts? You had to direct us.
Cornell.
Yeah, so, I think for me, and I think most like my panelists, probably fellow panelists as well, is I've dealt with unconscious bias from a personal perspective and also from a professional one when it's not necessarily directed at me. And then I also want to say that you also deal with unconscious bias when you are a bystander and that you are not necessarily that you're witnessing unconscious bias as well. I have to say that my professional and bystander approach is very oftentimes sometimes different than my personal approach. But I've learned to really, as an educator, you learn to step back and say, okay, what's happening here? What are the facts and the history that have led us to this point? How do I begin to engage in a conversation with an individual or a group of people where unconscious bias is in place? So I'm a big fan of asking questions. So let's say, for example, I'm out to dinner and I'm with a bunch of my, fellow people of color, and we're laughing, we're loud, we're having a good time. And this has happened to me before, where someone who identifies as white will come over and say, and say, you all are being, really, really loud and you're disrupting everyone else. And I've had someone say, like, you all are like a gang. And that language for people of color, for Black people, is a very targeted language. And so my approach is to say, tell me why you feel that way. Tell me why that language. And most of the time, they have no answer, right? Because they didn't think about, and then that's unconscious bias. They didn't think about what they were saying before they said it. So for me, it's challenging through questioning. And oftentimes that isn't, always a cookie cutter answer. It doesn't always work, but it's a way that allows me to maintain my own sense of mental health and control over my emotion without allowing their actions and behaviors to impact me in a way that doesn't look kindly on me in a public sense, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So asking challenging questions, I really like that. That's one that I think we can all incorporate. Aundrea, can you?
Yeah, I can chime in here. So I personally identify as a Black woman, and there are a lot of stereotypes that come with that, a lot of unconscious bias related specifically to that identity. And one challenge that I often face in the unconscious bias arena is being misrepresented or sort of judged unfairly for how loud I am and how directly I speak, and just being called aggressive and I'm too blunt and words I can't say on this panel right now. And so for me, it's really important to flip that narrative. And so to be able to change those perceptions from negatives to positives. So going in to meeting new people and going into new jobs and going into new conversations at work, I often sort of start by saying, just so you know, my personality, my communication style is very direct, and I hope that you don't take it personally, but I'm here to solve this problem and I want to work with you together on it. So I sort of address it at the front end and try and flip it from a negative thing to really a positive thing. I'm direct, I'm not afraid to speak up. You know that I'm going to provide you with my honest opinion, so you never have to worry about me sort of hiding the truth over here.
Is it my turn?
Yes, I think it's you.
Okay. Well, I think I got a few decades on some of you, but as an anthropologist, it's my job to see unconscious bias. So whenever I take those unconscious bias quizzes and tests, I always show up that I don't have any unconscious bias. And then they go, how do you do that? And I go, well, duh. It's my job to see it. So I can see it in the questions and I can see it in behaviors and stuff. That is what I'm trained to do and what I'm trained to see. I've been the subject of unconscious bias. The largest one is with male and female coming up as a scientist and fully equipped with mathematics and combining fields to create a new field with the math and the science and bringing that together with anthropology. That hadn't been done before. So anytime you're an innovator, no matter, who you are and what you look like, oftentimes you get unconscious bias. But and more recently, because I am, outlived my enemies, I'm seeing unconscious bias as being an older female. And so I see that a lot. And, when everyone says, well, it's not personal. Well, I'm sorry, it is. It is. And now the way to handle it, though, is to take it up a level, though, and to treat it more abstractly so that you don't get involved in the personal back and forth. That's the thing that I find interesting. I will say, the gender thing is the most prevalent, and that's the one that I've seen a lot. I can also, and I've also experienced personally, when I was working on looking at network analysis and looking at epidemiology, a lot like they're doing right now with COVID-19, but in the earlier decades when we were looking at it with the spread of AIDS, HIV, I would be at the NIH and with the CD and inside the CDC, and the elevator doors would open on the floors where they were doing all the AIDS testing, and I would literally see people back away from the open elevator door in response. So I thought that was really interesting, because they didn't realize that was just unconscious bias. It was all about the fear and the unknown at that time. Now, of course, it's more well understood and things like that. But I only bring that up because it's relevant now with COVID-19. We're probably going to see a lot of that going on too.
Absolutely. That's excellent.
Can I just say one other thing?
Yes, please.
So when I see unconscious bias as a female academic in the world of male academia, particularly in business schools, what I often did, and I know I've mentioned this to Waziri, I thought I should mention it, I would actually use the unconscious bias in my favor. People would look at me as being less threatening because I was female and I was, quote, in the soft science, not realizing that I'd had all this science in the background. So what I would often do is slide in because I would be viewed as less threatening, and then pop them later when they would be most unsuspecting at that point. So I get a kind of a little bit of a passive aggressive joy out of that. But the whole point is that we still have unconscious bias. I think as an anthropologist, we always will, particularly when it comes to males and females, regardless of color of skin, color of hair, high, low, wide, narrow. You have, and also diversity of thought. You still have a lot of that going on. And I know with the Me Too and all that other kind of stuff, but I'm telling you, it's going to be decades before we really get that out of society.
And that's really what brought us here, right? In the discussions, I think we've all realized, I'm a father of 3. You might hear them dancing around in the background screaming, but I have to teach them how to deal with the real world. And they're going to meet this issue. And so Cornell mentioned something great. It was about mental health. And I think that a large part of what I really thought about in this panel was, how do we give advice on keeping your mental health, keeping cool until you develop the techniques to manage this. And so if you could give us each of you give us an idea of how did you keep your cool and keep your mental health, in basically where it needed to be as you develop the techniques that you have used over the years.
That's a really good question. I think for me, and I'll be honest, it took me probably 10 years to figure out my techniques, and I'm still figuring it out. And so I'm not sure that you never, that you are to a point where you're where you perfected it, right? I think you're always getting better. For me, it's recognizing that other people's ignorance and ugliness is not about me, right? Like, right. It's really about them and their lack of knowledge or lack of information and understanding of the world around them. And when I try my hardest not to take it personal, it makes it easier to be present in the moment and to address it. And again, like I said earlier, not allow that ugliness and their behavior to impact me and how I show up in a space that may not be, that may conflict with the values that I want to give out. So it's really about being that self awareness and that self-love. I have found that the more that I have grown to love myself, my Blackness, my queerness, all those different things, the harder it has been for other people's bias and ignorance to impact me, because I'm not allowing them to tell my story. I'm telling my own story, and they don't get to do that. And I do want to note earlier too, because I think we've been talking about this from a perspective of, I'm a DEI professional and that I've experienced bias, but I want to say it first and foremost that over 10 years of doing this work, I still commit bias. right? I want to make that very clear. I think oftentimes we put DEI professionals on this pedestal that like, oh, you're the perfect ones and you know it all, and clearly you're free of all your bias. I don't think that that's ever possible. And I would love to hear your thoughts on this too. And Aundrea, that like bias is a natural part of how we navigate the world. So for me, bias itself isn't necessarily the problem. It's our unwillingness to be moved from that initial assumption of what I thought to be true. And so me as a cisgender Black gay man, I too have bias and have to work every single day to overcome that. So I want to make that very clear that I'm not just a recipient of it. I sometimes have to check myself and be called in on my own behavior as well.
Excellent.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's important to note, like, bias is literally our brain sort of making these shortcuts, right? And so there's no way for us, Karen, correct me if I'm wrong, to really remove that feature of our brain, but it's really about how we react and how we move forward from that, and how we take corrections, and if someone calls us out on it, like how we change next time. So yeah, I love that you said that, Cornell.
Yeah, I think, I mean, in fact, the work I do with looking at the networks inside organizations and communities, I depend on bias. Bias is always out there. And if were it not for bias, we could never do an analysis of organizational culture or anything like that. So it's bias that makes us who we are. The challenge is to rise above it and then to integrate it. I mean, thank goodness for bias, because it's an opportunity to integrate and take in all this diverse thought and have it come in, and then we can innovate and come up with new ideas. I mean, in a way, I mean, that's what innovation is. Innovation is a new idea pounding up against the wall of tradition or convention. And if that wall wasn't there, we would just go right through. So you need some resistance to be able to come back. So we do need bias, but what we need to do is to be, I agree with what everyone has said here. We got to be better people about how we handle it. And I'm always trying to work on that one. With every year, I come up with new ways and new techniques. Not one of them have I found to be a winning solution, but I still keep working.
And then, Waziri, to go back to your original question about sort of mental health and how we handle these things in these workplaces, I also just wanted to call out, like, for me personally, sort of similar to Cornell, it's a journey, right? Like, I haven't figured this all out myself either, especially working in the diversity space and inclusion space. But I think therapy has been really important. And I know that comes with a place of privilege because it's often fairly expensive. But I definitely have utilized different communication coaches as well to say, you know, why do you need to say this in this meeting? Why do you want to have the last word? Why did you think this person communicated poorly, and what could you have done better? Working through some of those questions with a therapist or communications coach has been really helpful, and I would definitely recommend it to others.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That is excellent. I heard some really good points come out there, and one of, two things emerged, right? Cornell, thank you for your comment. I still commit bias. And Karen, as you pointed out, and Aundrea too, these are mental shortcuts in our minds that we use to make quick decisions. But, speaking about therapy, the techniques that we have available to us, how do we begin straightening out our own shortcuts? How do we essentially ensure that in acting the way we want to be treated, we are adding or doing our part? If you can give some kind of insights into how you developed that, ability to say, okay, I'm doing this. How do I reiterate so that I get better at it? And then others will see my approach and perhaps adopt it, or at least start to mimic it with me.
That's such a great question. And I think, as Aundrea said, it's a journey. It doesn't happen overnight. It takes practice. I had to, and I often tell people all the time that in order to, your brain is telling itself a story that it has been taught, passed down from parents and other people's, issues with the world and things like that. So you've learned all these stories, and there are certain aspects of the truths that you don't know. I always tell people when I do training, there are multiple truths that exist at once, right? And I think it's important that we educate ourselves to understand the multiple truths that exist that can begin to contradict some of the stories that we were raised to believe, right? And so, and begin to challenge some of the biases that we were taught, quite frankly. And so I read a lot. I've read all different types of articles and books about what it means to be other identities that I don't hold, which helps me, and from people who and books and articles written by people who exist in those spaces, who are trans, who are women, who are, you know, undocumented, because they're telling their own truth. And so by hearing their truth, it allows me to go, okay, wow, what I thought I knew either wasn't completely the story or wasn't the story at all. And it's a constant willingness, and I'm blanking on the term that I always use, cultural humility, that allows me to continue learning, because I never learn all there is to know. And then, you know, once you're doing all that learning too, I find that that knowledge constantly comes up to you naturally when you run up against these stereotypes and these biases. But you have to have the willingness to admit that you don't know everything, and to be able to be reflective. I, in college, started beginning to practice reflecting on my thoughts, reflecting on my behavior, and it's become a natural thing for me of like, why am I thinking that? You know, when I see certain things and I start to believe certain things, why is that? Where did I get that from? And why is that coming up for me?
Excellent. So I'm just taking notes here because there's so many jewels of, you know, wisdom that you guys are dropping. Challenging through question, you know, 10 years, I think it kind of points at that mastery of yourself. Maybe it's the 10,000 hours, etc. So it's obviously a journey that we all have to undertake. Let's start with the little things, microaggressions. Some of the little things that we can all point and say, oh yes, I know I felt that way. Can we speak about or can you give some advice in regards to how we can all start individually encountering those so that we're moving down that path, right? Again, it's a bit of techniques here, but also identifying some of the key microaggressions you guys have encountered and giving any suggestions you have to deal with them. Aundrea, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, I can jump in first. I think it's important for us to be able to recognize what is a microaggression, because a lot of folks, especially underrepresented people, underrepresented minorities, women, often will blame something else and not realize that they just experienced a microaggression. When people don't ask me how to pronounce my name and just kind of wave over it and just call me whatever they want, start calling me Dre or anything like that, like, I take that as a microaggression, because I need you to understand that my name is just as important as yours. And even though, you know, Aundrea can be pronounced in 17 different ways, and I definitely empathize with folks who have more names that are more challenging. I do recognize that mine is not the most challenging, but having people mess up names or call me the name of another Black woman at work is a microaggression, right? And so I think in terms of tools, being able to identify and be comfortable with like assuming that it's a microaggression and accepting that it's a microaggression, because oftentimes we want to say, oh, they were just tired, or oh, they didn't realize they were doing it, oh, they just didn't know. And we make a lot of excuses for people. And I think before we can sort of correct any actions, we have to be able to admit that they're happening. And then once we know that they're happening, then we can use the tools and use communication to work them out and to educate people, to coach people, to tell them why I don't like it when you do this, or why it can be offensive when you do this. But yeah, I definitely think sort of recognition is the first step.
Absolutely. Cornell, you want to take a stab at this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Aundrea has said everything that I would have said for sure. It's just, I mean, again, that awareness is so necessary and so important to understand what it is that I'm that I'm looking at, and how do I define it? And I think there's so many different definitions of microaggression that people kind of run by, but like understanding what it truly is helps us to be able to identify, but then also helps us to be able to recognize ways in which we have helped perpetuate some of those microaggressions as well. And so I'm all about like really being self-aware and owning my own stuff, while I'm also teaching other people to own theirs as well. But I've got to know, you know, so I read all the articles about training doesn't work, diversity training doesn't work. And I always say diversity training alone doesn't work, right? Like people have to develop the awareness that they need to be able to know what they're talking about, what they're looking at, and what is the problem. And then we can go on to some of the other things that help us to begin to mitigate the impact of those things.
Absolutely. And Karen, any thoughts?
I have so many thoughts on this subject. I don't even know where to begin. I have probably committed a lot of microaggressions. I've had them committed against me, so many, too numerous to mention, that I just shed them off. I just become Teflon girl, and they just slide right off of me. But I was just thinking as you guys were talking about my good friend. He identifies as gay, and he calls himself Lovable Brown. And I go, okay, that's great. And then occasionally he'll talk about, he'll tease me and or his partner by saying, you white people, and why do you do this, or blah 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 and all this. And so I'm just thinking of him because he is so beautiful, he's so lovely, and he's like, oh, he's like so accepting, he's completely accepting. So he's doing that as teasing, is provoking, and I love the fact that he's a provocateur like that. I oftentimes do the same thing when sometimes I'm misunderstood, when really all I'm trying to do is be the provocateur, and that's what he's doing. And I love the fact that he does it, and it just rolls right over on me. I go, oh, okay, let me try to, you know, let's talk about this tribe or this tribe or this tribe. And of course, we're all very good friends, and we have a highly diverse tribe here where I am in Dallas. It's been fabulous. But I was just thinking about how it's it's one thing when you have your tribe of your friends and you take it all and you roll with it. It's another thing when you're in the workplace, and then you've got inclusion, exclusion, you've got points of access or no access. And I've certainly had my share of those, as has he. And so it's really interesting to learn from those experiences. And then, like I said earlier, how to take it to a higher level when it may not be personal in that sense, because the bias may go so deep that people don't even know that they're committing it. And so how do you get them to come around and question it? For the most part, when I'm faced with this, I just deadpan it, and then I'll ask a question right back, which is I try to flatline it, do the managerial mask and flatline it, and come back, and so that people can't read my face, and I just look like I'm asking an innocent question. Of course, I know, just like you all. I mean, but you have to do it so you allow them a blank canvas to respond back to. And then when you do it that way, then you draw people out, and then you can have a conversation about it.
Absolutely. I love it. You know, I'm going to recap because I heard so many great things that I want to point out. You know, Aundrea's point on self-reflection, I think it's very clear that one person saying something to me or a word is okay, but another person saying it is a microaggression. And
Right.
Therefore, there's this need to kind of look at yourself and understand, why does this thing bother you? Recognizing the way our universe works, it is what it is, and how you respond to it is one thing. I really love that there's this communication, and I think you all kind of noted the deadpan and the question it. Cornell brought up question it, and Karen added, let's deadpan first. But I kind of love that you do have an option.
Yeah.
You can react in a way that's not angry or, you know, other than questioning, to actually move the conversation along and maybe perhaps address the issue in a way that helps them think about it, and really helps, you know. And then I think there's something you brought up that I like, which is really letting it slide. You know, because, you know, I think there's a comment about carrying a hot coal in your hand is like carrying anger around, and that
Right.
mental health issues and the stress and the frustration. One of the things that I'm going to move, this is not one of the questions that we sent to you guys earlier, but this is about the ecosystem, right? So Cornell, you mentioned training alone is not going to do this. If you three could create the ecosystem, could you give us an idea of what it would look like?
The ecosystem,
That would, you know, so you say we have metrics about bias in our company. And at Cornell, I think when I saw you speak first, you spoke about some of the different things you were doing, and all of them were intentional and all of them had some impact. Could you give us an idea of what that kind of tool set looks like in you guys' hands?
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, it's a very complex, multi-pronged strategy, right? Like the opportunity to become more aware of the world around us is super critical, and how the world is different from how I see and know it to be is super critical. But then what happens after the training's over, right? It becomes this one stop. Okay, we did your unconscious bias training for the quarter, and we're done now, and you're good, and you got this certificate, and now we're all good, you know. And as much as I love some of these brands, you know, Starbucks and all these other companies that have shut down their companies for a day to do unconscious bias training, yeah, that's a great place to begin. But what happens once the trainers leave? How are we making sure that our employees and our colleagues understand that diversity, equity, inclusion is a pertinent part of the business? And that means managers have to make sure that they're bringing up in staff meetings, that they're reminding the direct reports that, hey, you need to be thinking about how diversity, equity, inclusion is infused into your work every single day. VPs, CEOs, the whole C-suite has to make sure that every all hands, every all hands email has to infuse why diversity, equity, and inclusion is necessary. Because in my opinion, the more our leaders and the more our line managers are constantly bringing up, the more our employees recognize, understand that this is not going away. This is not a, every quarter thing, or a once a quarter thing. This is an everyday, all day, 24/7 conversation. The other thing I want to make sure that we make very clear too is I think that we also, while I want to note that I speak in I statements. So when I choose my strategy for how I respond to unconscious bias, that's what works for me, right? But I also want to be very clear that in order to make this thing work, we have to also be able to accept where people are. And that means if I misgender someone and they respond to me in anger, that is where they are. And I don't get to take their feelings and go, well, you didn't give it to me in a Tiffany's box, so I'm not going to accept that. That I think it's necessary that it's not always up to everyone to be a teacher. I get paid to teach. So I'm gonna show up and teach. But not every person who experiences unconscious bias and microaggressions has to teach. And it's also very much okay for someone to say, I'm not going there with you. Go read a book, go Google it, Bing it or Yahoo it, right? and go learn for yourself, because I don't think that everyone has to give that emotional labor to someone, right? If that's not where they are emotionally in their life. I think that we have to begin to accept multiple ways and multiple tools in our tool belt that allows people to approach the conversation where they need to approach it. And for me not to take that person's anger personally, that's about 25, 30, 40, 50 years of being misgendered. And that's much larger than just this one incident. Sorry, I'll shut up now.
No,
Yeah, that's right.
That's why I wanted you all here. It's about getting your honest feedback. I think you guys are on the forefront of really exploring that aspect of human nature within organizations, and how do we, as a community, leverage our biases, as you said, straightening out the shortcuts to unlock innovation, to unlock productivity, and unlock wealth, and all the other things that we strive for. So I'd love to, I'll just recap, awareness development. You mentioned training, and what happens when they leave. So I think that we're gathering, very much it's a marathon, not a sprint, from a managerial perspective, and you want them to kind of plan further out. Aundrea and Karen, what things would you add to the ecosystem that you found may be beneficial on your end, your best methods?
Yeah, so I work at a global company, so we have offices in 14 countries, and there's a level of inclusion and diversity that exists differently when you're working not just with an American audience, and so, or with American colleagues rather. And so I think that in addition to unconscious bias trainings and building accountability of how are we actually using these trainings, we also just need cultural awareness trainings. How do I walk into a business meeting in Singapore? How do I greet somebody in Germany? How do I, what is the touch relationship? You know, different countries, you can be a little bit more physically close to each other than others is a little bit further away than I'm used to. And so little things like that, I think, until we really truly understand other cultures and people who are different than us, even if we are minorities, right? As a Black woman, I'm often a minority in a room, but it's still very important for me to learn about the other cultures with the colleagues that I work with. So I definitely would say cultural education, as well as making sure that we are minorities in different spaces. So even if I'm working with a colleague who is a cis hetero white male, having him be in a room with maybe our Black employee resource group and really understanding what it's like to be the only in that space, whereas usually in most rooms that colleague is probably the majority. And so I think challenging the spaces that we're in so that we can learn from other people's perspectives as well.
Yeah, that's good. I'll follow up on that, Aundrea. Those are great comments, because I've had to work globally for many decades, and where I'm working with people where I'm the only person, or I'm advising or helping other people where either they're the only or they're the majority, and making them also more aware. So to your point, Aundrea, I would the behavioral things is the things on the outside are cultural protocols, which have to do with distancing and touching and the way that you speak and things like that. Those are good to know. And there is education and training for that, and that's quite helpful. The other side that I spent a lot of time on is not so much that, largely because you acquire that over, if you're globally dispersed with all these different companies. But the other thing that I spend time with is looking at data using evidence-based findings. So when I look at global companies and I look at their networks, and I can actually show how their own data reveals, after they've qualified for all of these diversity awards, how their own data shows how they are biased, and it's their data. I didn't do anything to it. I just reflected it back, showing the communications data. So while they might be quite integrated when it comes to work, when you look at other questions, like when it comes to expertise or innovation, they start to move off into exclusionary groupings. And that is, of course, that's seeding exclusion. And of course, that's based on bias. So I get to show that to folks. And then what happens is that when you show it to them and they realize it's their data and you haven't done anything to their data, then that's when the learning and the conversations happen. And that's great, because they go, wow, we thought we had this down. We could clearly see that when it comes to, when we're working in this area of our culture, we tend to show more bias. And that's why people don't even realize, even leaders don't even realize that they can say contradictory statements. I can really be all open and very inclusive when it comes to this aspect of work. But then when it comes to maybe I'm in a more relaxed setting or I'm talking about new ideas, I don't realize that as through the informal exchange, that bias is starting to creep in. And so those two can be completely contradictory in the same person. And we have to be understanding about that. So we have to say, applaud people for doing really well maybe in the workplace, but that they got to dig deeper when it comes to looking at expertise and innovation, or just more casual, informal conversations with folks. So on the surface, protocol, and deeper down for a deeper dive, you got to look at their actual bias data, because when people see their own data reflected back, it's like, there's nowhere to go. I mean, they got to accept it. That's where the learning happens, I find.
I love it. I love it. And, you know, that actually segues. So I'm going to put this out to the audience. Please, Sergio, could you please unmute Cornell? Because I think once we get out, we are here.
Yep.
But the data point, I love that because it's accountability, Aundrea, which you mentioned. And in you all's experience, you know, so the topic here is playing unconscious bias in your favor. And there's this idea of we meet resistance, and if we just keep pushing at it, you know, true power, we can break through. But in your experience, I think that there's situations where folks meet resistance, and it's not going to change unless they can challenge it, right, without the data. So what data would you suggest, or not suggest, but have you seen as most effective from the perspective of an individual that's facing it? How do you gather the arguments, the stories, okay, there were 7 microaggressions last week, or this happened, that happened, this is evidence of. What advice can you give to the audience to say, when you are meeting this resistance, we found that these are some useful techniques that not only move the needle, but prove the point?
Who are you talking to?
Quirky question, but I think that it's, in your experience, you might have encountered it, not necessarily a whistleblower kind of argument, but more of a person who's going to walk in with some really good best methods to address an issue with management.
Anybody want to go first? I can go. So the thing that I tend to look at, or tend to tell people to look at, I mean, one, we have to determine, does that person who we're talking about have access to the company data? Because not everyone has access to company data, right? As someone who works, you know, who is HR adjacent, I can get access to company data. And so some of the data that I tend to use to make strong cases are, one, I think the anecdotal or the qualitative data is really important, right? That's what people are experiencing. And so being able to, you know, talk about the different experiences that, you know, people have been having at the company, whether it's microaggressions or being called another Black woman's name, or, you know, having someone touch my hair. I'm bald, so I don't have any hair, but you know what I mean, right? And so like having those behaviors and those experiences sort of listed, and say like, here's what I've been experiencing on a day-to-day basis. But then also, here's who's leaving the company, right? And so if I'm noticing that we're losing people of color left and right, that's something to, at the very, and why I can't necessarily tie it to microaggressions necessarily, unless we do exit interviews, which is another whole other conversation that companies should be doing to determine why their employees are leaving. But we can begin to at least investigate that, we're losing a lot of people of color. Why is that? At the very begin to ask the question of what's happening, right? And then we most likely can get to the answer of, there's something happening that is not creating a culture of belonging for people to want to stay. So who's leaving? Why are they leaving? What are the qualitative narratives that are existing and happening? Because while I love data, you know, the hard number data, I think sometimes we rely on that too much, and we forget that people's stories are very real, and that is strong data to be looking at. And then you can also think about pay equity, right? Like, you know, why are, you know, women are still being paid less than men doing the same exact work? So what, you know, and digging deeper into that form of inequity as well, and presenting all of that as, we have an issue here that needs to be addressed. And while it may not be intentional, because, you know, you constantly have to, you know, pat people on the back and say, I know you didn't mean it, right? But like, it's happening. And so let's do something about it. If this doesn't align with our values, which leads me to the next piece, is that if this is I love throwing companies' values back in their face, right? Hey, here's what we said we believed in or believe in, and here's how this action or this experience is not aligning with the values we preach every single day. Let's get there. So I'll stop there.
No, that's excellent. So I'm just going to throw out some of these really great suggestions. Paying attention to attrition, I think at the managerial level and even at the employee level is, I think, relevant. The point about exit interviews is actually really well brought up, because that's a data point. And then, you know, identifying the qualitative narratives in the best way possible, being aware. Again, that word awareness comes up. But I definitely love the compensation pay equity point, and then the values, right? Which is saying, do we have cognitive dissonance within the organization? And, you know, being able to bringing it to light to say, this is a qualitative and quantitative matter that we can address. Aundrea and Karen, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I want to play off one thing Cornell said in regards to his access to data. And so acknowledging that a lot of people here are maybe on HR teams or HR adjacent and don't have access to numbers like retention rates or exit interview information. And so like, what can you do if you want to do more and you want to get more data, but you don't have the access? And I would just recommend to folks to work really specifically and intentionally with HR partners. So whether it's your D&I lead or it's your HR VP, or maybe you even are working directly with like the head of talent acquisition, but make sure that you have strong partnerships because those people do have access to data, and recognize that as someone who's not on the HR team, like you might not be given that same access. However, you can leverage those relationships to build out a plan and a project plan, for lack of a better word, to address some of the issues that we're talking about today. So maybe working with the talent acquisition team to say, hey, what are the percentage of folks who are making it to on-site interviews who identify as XYZ, and then leveraging that data to say, well, I think if we shifted this part of our interview process or this part of our sourcing process, we might be able to get that number higher.
That's good.
That's a great point.
I like that. And I'm going to also come back and comment on the value of the cultural landscape and looking at the data from a cultural landscape. And I'll give you an example. We've just, I don't know if you guys watched the press release this morning with Tony Fauci talking from the NIH. He was talking about the COVID-19 and trying to, because normally on epidemiology, when you look at the spread of a disease or the spread, just think of bias as a disease, or it's a vector. Bias is a vector. It travels on a human vector just like a disease does. And normally it goes up into a sharp peak and then it comes down. And what he's talking about in his press releases, the head of NIH, is that he wants to flatten that curve to where it's not so sharp. That's the man that I worked with for years with the NIH in about 3 different studies, showing him his data. He looks at it from the disease standpoint. I'm looking at his internal data from communication standpoint, and I'm showing him the same thing, the same damn thing. He's looking at bias and it peaks up. And so I said, and then he asked me, so well, what do you think about this? And I said, well, I don't know. I can tell you what I might think, but I'm going to tell you what the data says because I'm focused on the data. But data to data, if I'm talking to somebody like a Tony Fauci or an HR human people analytics person, they actually, that's where it is helpful. So I think it's good to do both. So when I was getting my training, anthropology at the time was a lot of qualitative, largely qualitative. And when I came over from quantum physics and chemistry to combine these 2 fields together in a different way, they were confused because from an academic standpoint, they didn't quite understand how the 2 could blend, but of course they have, because there's a whole science about how you can be connected in networks, which we all know. This is before Facebook and all that kind of stuff. This is back when dinosaurs roamed the earth. Okay, I was doing this research. So the interesting thing about it is that when you show it to people in their world, like with a Tony Fauci, when I had to work with him, or with Toyota, when, as you said earlier, when they saw that all this attrition, they were losing all these people. They were losing people of color. They were losing their experts. Why was that? But they didn't, you could have told them that. You could have told them the stories, but they might not have believed it. But when they see in mass the data, they go, holy hell, yeah, that is happening. we can absolutely see this is going to be a trend. We don't want to follow the trend, or as Fauci said, or he was borrowing from Wayne Gretzky. He said, you're not skiing to where the puck is, you're going to ski to where the puck is going to be. So what you want to do is, you don't want to follow the trend, you want to get ahead of the trend so that you can really tamp it down if it's going to be harmful to the culture by, usurping some of your values because of unfettered bias. You want to tamp down that bias, or you want to treat it in such a way that it goes away. It may not go completely away, but it can be more integrated into blended and woven into the values of the culture. So that is, it's an artful, it requires qualitative and quantitative approaches, and it really is an art on how you blend those two together to tell a compelling story to an organization. I'm always on the outside because I'm the anthropologist that's brought in. So I'm always on the outside looking in. On the inside, it's a whole different world because you've got to change things from the inside. I get that. So I also find that it's also a good approach from a technique standpoint, coming back to Waziri's statement, is that you need an inside person and you need an outside person, because if you've got to shoot somebody, better to shoot the outside person because you want to leave all the the trouble. So I've got a lot of scars in my back because it's perfectly fine. I said, you can shoot me, just don't shoot anybody else. You can shoot me, and let me tell you what the news is. So I find that that's people do want to know, but you have to present it to them wherever they are so that they're not feeling threatened by whatever the stories or the data is, and they feel engaged, and then that draws them into learning. And then once they learn more, then they are more open to changing their behavior.
Absolutely. This has been so excellent, and I think you guys have said so many things that I wanted to hear you say, and really answered, just given such great perspective. To wrap up, I would love to just kind of go through Aundrea, Karen, and then Cornell to close out. If you could just let us know any books, resources, or links that you've encountered. And obviously, I'd love to have information shared later on that we can share with the audience. We'll also be giving out some articles from Harvard Business Publishing on some of what our discussions have been. But I would love to get your favorites, books, resources, links that have helped you on this path.
So yeah, jumping in here. As I mentioned, I think learning about other cultures is such an important part of this puzzle. And so one resource that I recommend is a podcast called Code Switch, which is a podcast by NPR. Yay, Cornell listens. But it's really, really great because they touch on so many different topics of identity and so many different things that I just hadn't even thought about, like the explanatory comma. So when we're talking and we have to make that decision of, okay, do I have to add in a little bit of explanation about what I'm saying, or will everybody understand automatically? And there's just so many really great topics that spark conversation amongst other Code Switch listeners. So definitely recommend that.
Excellent. So you guys all hear that, Code Switch. Check out the podcast.
I heard it. I'm going to check it out.
All right. Karen.
Well, there is this sweet little book. There's a number of new books that are out there, but I'm going to give you an abstract approach, but it's not really abstract. It's Mary Douglas, How Institutions Think. You can read Michel Foucault, The Archaeology of Knowledge, Discipline and Punish, and you can read philosophers, all that kind of stuff, which I've read him like 10 times straight through. But if I didn't have to do research or get a PhD, and I wanted to hand somebody, look at that. It's some lectures, but it is so telling about how institutions think. And what she's talking about is bias and inclusion and exclusion and cultural norms. And it's really great. And she's extremely provocative. I just love her.
Can you repeat the name?
Yeah, How Institutions Think.
And what's the author's name? Mary?
Mary Douglas. She's passed on now. Just so you know, I saw her give a talk to the big meeting of anthropologists, the national meeting, and she basically, in a very abstract way, insulted everybody there. And I was sitting on the front row and I started laughing. And she wasn't really insulting, she's being provocative, but I don't think anybody got it. Or I just don't, and I was just tickled pink because it was coming right out of this, because she was talking about how as a discipline, as an anthropologist, they have this, they're subject to the same, of course, you know, they're subject to the same things, but they couldn't, I don't think they had a sense of humor. I don't think that they got her. But you can read this. It is funny. She's funny when she goes and talks about some things anyway. And she's provocative. So I always recommend this one.
Thank you so much. And Cornell, we are coming up on the hour, but I'd love to have you close us out and then maybe give some final comments, if anything.
Yeah, there's so many books. My husband is always telling me to stop buying books because I just buy them and then I read them and some I don't get to. But the one that really came to mind, anything by Audre Lorde, anything by Bell Hooks. One of the first books that really hit me hard was Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire, which was translated from Portuguese into so many different languages, but talks about sort of, you know, the concept of how oppressed people tend to navigate the world as well, and how at some point to gain our own privilege, we tend to mimic the oppressor, and that really hit me hard and sort of influences how I do my work. Obviously, Code Switch, as my girl Aundrea said, that is a podcast you must download. The Memo, I forget the woman's name who wrote this book. It's blinking on me. But
Minda Hart. It's in the comments, actually.
Yeah, it's a great book that really, again, stepping outside of your own lived experiences and reading of what it's, you know, what it's like to be someone else. You can't step into their shoes, but you can hear from them. Brene Brown, Daring Greatly, and The Power of Vulnerability really hit me hard in how I do my work and how I show up as a man with male privilege in spaces and things of that sort. And then Any Lecture by Joy DeGruy. She's just amazing, talks about PTSD amongst African Americans and things of that sort. So those are just some of the things that I've read that has influenced how I navigate the world, both as someone of privilege and someone who has marginalized identities and as an educator.
I'm going to have to follow up with you for those names, Cornell, because I was writing and trying to spell, but those are all excellent resources.
I put them in the chat, so.
Absolutely, please do. Guys, thank you so much. We have 2 minutes more on this panel, but if you guys have any closing thoughts, and to all of you who are listening and just kind of hopefully enjoying this as much as I am, you know, we don't have any more time for questions, but please feel free to close us out, Cornell, Karen, or Aundrea.
I just think it's been a pleasure actually to be here with all of you and to hear your comments. And so thank you for including me.
Thank you.
I'll mimic that. Thank you so much for having me. Please feel free to share my my Twitter and my email. Folks want to, you know, sort of connect again and continue talking. I love talking about this topic, and particularly talking with people who are also just as educated as I am on these things. This is work that we all have to do together. There is no one way to navigate, I think, these issues, and that we're all out there doing what we can to make it work, but at most part, taking care of ourselves first, putting our mask on first before we put on other people's masks is very, very necessary.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much. I do all appreciate you. Go ahead, Aundrea.
Oh, I was just going to say thank you again. I hope to be able to reach out to some of the folks who are on the call, so connect with me on LinkedIn and send out my info as well. So thank you so much.
Absolutely.